Well, I'm Dave Carlson. I'm a video producer in Minneapolis and St. Paul area. And both my parents were born in Minnesota, and I came back in 1979, but I think I've had an interest in mostly radio to begin with. Probably in late elementary school. For some reason I got interested in radio. I had a little 6-transistor radio that I would put up to my ear at night and listen to St. Louis Cardinal baseball broadcasts on KMOX radio, and then got kind of interested in listening to the music stations when I lived in Iowa, and ended up kind of cultivating that interest, and I actually had my own little radio station for a while. It only got out about a block, and it was such that I had a little 45 RPM record player. I put a little microphone down next to it and then run out on my bike and see how far the signal would go while the music was playing. And had a few people that could actually tune me in on the AM radio in the neighborhood, and so I had kind of a fascination to be a radio announcer or work in the radio industry for a while. So I went to college in Illinois and became a radio and television communications major and graduated and did some work there. But my first job was at a area community college in Illinois, where video was really just coming into being for people outside of the actual television broadcasting industry. So the community college invested in a Sony Portapack, and we started making videos, and I became a little bit more on the video side. I worked at a local radio station too for a while, but video seemed to have a lot more possibilities of where it was going, and so we started doing videos for the community college. I moved up to Minnesota after a few years there and became one of the first video people hired by the Minnesota Zoo, which had just opened a year before. And so I got to do video programs on baby animals and conservation efforts and wildlife and things like that. And it was a fascinating job. I really enjoyed it a lot there. But I did end up moving on to, after about 4 or 5 years, to Hennepin County Library and became their audiovisual director. But we had a TV station there, TV studio, I mean. And after a few years, we decided to start producing some regular television series. And so we did 3 main ones. The primary one that I worked on the longest was a program called Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and authors. And we did mostly through Hennepin County Library, and then eventually we shifted it to MetroNet and Minnesota Center for the Book, and the Minnesota Humanities Commission was involved later on in that. And so we produced 490 half-hour episodes of interviews with all things Minnesota literature oriented, including a lot of the prominent authors at the time. This was probably from about 1988 up until 2000. So Bill Holm and John Hassler and Patricia Hampel. We did iconic writers near the end of their lives, Tom McGrath and Meridel LeSueur, Frederick Manfred, J.F. Powers. And so we were real lucky to get those on tape, and a lot of them have now been archived digitally, and I'm going to work to try and ensure that all the programs that we did have a life after tape. And we also did a couple other series. One was called All About Kids, which focused on children and family issues. We actually did a lot of interviews with national children's authors that came through, like Madeline Langle, Eric Hill. We did even Captain Kangaroo, and it focused on a number of issues relating to families and children. Another program, because we started also having the opportunity to interview national authors that came through on tour. And so we did a program called A Discussion With these various national authors. And we had some pretty interesting people on that one too, like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, Ed McBain, and a number of others that were making it big in the national scene. I worked at a school district as video coordinator for the last 15 years. We just retired, so I'm kind of hoping to maybe do a little bit more with the original, especially the Northern Lights series, and see about better ways to archive and get the word out. I think a lot of the interviews that we did are still real timely. They're good historical looks at the writers of those times, but also deal with a lot of interesting Minnesota issues and events and things all about Minnesota. So that's kind of where I am today, and glad there still seems to be a big interest in in some of the interviews that we did do. I'm still involved with the annual Minnesota Book Awards as well, which are coming up April 21st of 2018, and I've been involved in that ever since almost the very start of the Book Awards. It started off as a book festival and has evolved into a real large annual celebration of Minnesota writers.
Yeah. Well, our lives connect so many ways. I mean, I took my inspiration for the video program, for variety of video programs from stuff you were doing, and I was the video person, not for the Minnesota Book Awards, but for quite a lot of years for the Minnesota Book Awards reading, which happened like the day after, while people were still in town, because there wasn't a substantial reading component on the award ceremony itself. So,
right. For a few years, we did a few episodes of the Northern Lights series based on the. We did some readings from the various nominees, and we did try and focus during the year a lot of interviews with the Minnesota authors that had won or were put up for nomination. So besides doing readings, we would do full interviews with a lot of them too. So that was one of the basis of how we chose the people to be interviewed, was if they were being recognized by the Minnesota Book Awards.
Well, you've had a remarkable scope. When did you get your first Sony pack?
It was 1976 or 77. I worked at Spoon River College, a little community college west of Peoria. And I started with the old, in fact it was a reel-to-reel deck, but pretty soon after that the video cassettes came out, so it was a lot easier to record and certainly to edit on. I first had to learn how to cut tape, just like they did with audio tape for many years, where you actually spliced the tape and put it together, and that was your edits. Luckily, I didn't have to do that very long, because that was very time-consuming and kind of cumbersome. But once video cassette editing came forth on 3/4 inch, it made it a lot easier. I still remember we had to manually queue up the tapes, and then you'd come to the edit point, and you'd either take it or bail, and then you'd start all over again and do it. But it advanced pretty quickly after that, where you could do insert editing, and it was linear editing, but you could still do some insert and change it around a little bit. But really was quite different editing than the non-linear, digital-based editing that everybody's doing now.
Right. No, I remember. I mean, I did very little of that, but I remember the message was that if you sit down to do that kind of editing, you will get up 6 hours later. That there were no small projects.
No, we did. I remember we did a 20-hour, a 20-minute video, and it was a lot of edits. It was kind of an early version of a music video. So we had a lot of editing and syncing it up to the music soundtrack and things like that. But we figured, two of us worked on it. We figured it took us about 150 hours to do that 120-minute.
Yes,
program.
That's what I remember, and that's when I decided that I was not going to edit. It's now much easier, but
yeah. But what Sony and the equipment at the time was so revolutionary, because it finally put video in the hands of people outside the television broadcast or film industries, and allowed people to kind of start doing things through the education areas, or even things on their own. That was also kind of the rise of, or the start of the rise of cable access programs. So first people were doing kind of storytelling and program making, that they hadn't really had access to do before. So that was it was a great time to get involved in video and see the growth of it, and see how video became such an ingrained part of what people could do. And now it's evolved even more, so that anybody with an iPhone can actually make a video program as well.
So, getting back to the origins, to your first work with this stuff, what was the draw? What was attracting you the most? Was it the technical end, or was it?
I would say I've usually centered more on content than the actual technical, not so much the bells and whistles. You have to learn a certain amount of technical aspects to be able to to do the editing and make sure that you had synchronization without the tape. I remember we used to have to, what we called, we'd have to lay down a black track on the tape first if you wanted to do insert editing over. So there were a lot of other different steps that you just had to make sure that you always kept sync, and you always, in the recording process too, that you always, were recording it correctly so that you'd have it to take into the editing. And then, how it was distributed as well. Did you play it back off a master? Did you make copies? And so those technical aspects, I learned enough of to get by. But I think I've always relied as much on content, because you can have all the bells and whistles in the world for editing and special effects and things like that. But if you don't have good content, I think it's sometimes for naught.
So what kind of content stuff was most interesting to you? I mean, you've done the animals, you've done the celebrities, you've done the kids. What attracted you the most?
I guess getting the start at a community college, so I became a little bit more based on education, information, and as it's just turned out at the various places I've worked at or had the opportunity to do, I really haven't done much commercial work. So I haven't done business videos or commercial recordings or TV commercials, things like that. So I've kind of stayed in the education and nonprofit and library worlds and worked to establish video as a good form of communication and information through those organizations.
Great. So you had. I know we're going to get to the celebrities and the kids and things, but I really want to spend a little bit of time with the animals, the zoo. How was that?
Well,
I've never done animals.
Yeah. It was a great time. I really liked the zoo. It was I was very fortunate to get the job because I applied from out of state. I was living in Illinois, and I was the only out of state person to apply. And I'm beholden to the then education director, who I think I provided just a little bit of a different outlook on how I would approach video. And so he really liked that, and I became good cohorts with him. And so he was kind of the education director at the time, the kind of a discovery lab called Zoo Lab that he ran. And so we teamed up together and made a lot of videos on how to get kids interested in seeing the animals, learning animal behaviors, and things like that. But so I did a lot of informational videos. We had video playback areas around the zoo, so that if you came up to, say, like the beaver exhibit, we had a video going on a constant loop on a videotape machine that was a little 8 to 10 minute video about beavers and their habitats, and and the exhibit at the zoo. And a lot of the fascinating behaviors, because you didn't always see the beavers when you were there, so at least you could watch the video and get a sense of, what they were, if they were in their den, and if the types of behaviors to look for and things when they were out doing. But it was a very active exhibit because we provide them birch trees, and they would actually kind of cut down the birch trees just like they would in the wild and put them in their den, make kind of a dam. And we had a camera in the den itself, and from what I can understand, it was really one of the first times that anybody had ever captured what beaver behavior was in their den, because the den was always under the dam, underwater. So it was pretty neat. Our footage got used on National Geographic specials and stuff like that. And I recorded a lot of animal bursts. I remember getting up at 3 in the morning and going out there early and getting camel bursts. And a lot of the bursts were not necessarily in the exhibits themselves, but they were in holding areas right off the exhibit. So we were able to capture a lot of rare bursts by spotted leopards and Siberian tigers and the Bactrian camels and just a number of the interesting animals that they had out at the Minnesota Zoo. We also got involved in marketing too, so we were providing some of the first public service announcements that the TV stations were airing. And because we were rather unique, and at that time the stations were airing PSAs a lot more than they do now. Generally now their public service is kind of geared to something that they're involved in, like a charity run or something that the station has their own name on it. But back then they'd run our PSAs during the 10 o'clock news, and so we really got a lot of audience for it. So I worked with our staff, and we created a lot of real fun little 30-second public service announcements about coming out to the zoo. And again, the zoo is brand new. It was only a year old, and so people were still learning about it and getting excited about it. And I think the TV stations loved the fact that they could show animal footage on the 10 o'clock news, and it was of great interest because it was still pretty new in a lot of people's minds. So we had fun. We did a public service announcement on cross-country skiing at the zoo when they just first started skiing out there. And I know one day they offered a free day and free cross-country skiing. They had 3,000 people show up to cross-country ski. And so basically it overwhelmed the ski trails, but it was still a fun outing, and everybody, I think, had a good time. So we did a lot of that. We started the first music series out at the zoo. At that time we called it Country Zoobilee, and I'm thinking that was kind of the precursor to the real successful zoo, music at the zoo series that they have now every summer out there. But I was involved in the very first one out there, and we video recorded it, and somewhere there, I think there's a tape of that somewhere. But so just a real fun place to work. I was there about 4.5 years.
Are there particular difficulties with doing animals?
Well, we tried as much as we could, and the zoo was great for this. The Minnesota Zoo was one of the kind of the newer, pardon the pun, breed of zoos, new kind of format where they were getting away from the zoos that were just cages and display of animals, and the Minnesota Zoo, along with a number of others that have come around that time and since, try and show the animals more in their natural habitat. And so the Minnesota Zoo is great in creating large habitat areas where the animals really would show what a lot of what they would do in the wild. They just weren't pacing around in cages. They were actually foraging in what would be their natural habitat, or similar to their natural habitat. The Japanese macaques could swing on the branches and jump in the water and a pond just like they would in their natural habitat. The Siberian tigers had, I'm guessing, 15 or 20 acres worth to roam around in, so they could actually kind of go display hunting techniques and how they would live, and that was actually, at the time, it was kind of controversial because a lot of people were used to coming out and being able to see the animals up close, and they actually had to kind of work at it to look at it. And the Siberian tiger exhibit, I remember in particular, was one that the tigers weren't always able to be seen because they were out somewhere in their natural habitat doing what tigers do, but a lot of times, sleeping behind a bush or something. And so we had a lot of complaints, and there was some rearranging of the exhibit to try and make it a little bit more, to make sure the animals were always at least, somewhat visible. But it created a great opportunity to educate people too about, wildlife isn't just for, seeing in a cage or seeing, up close. You really want to see them in their natural habitat, so it takes a little bit extra work and effort to do that. But and I think most people really accepted that because, again, when you saw the animals, they were displaying more the way they should be, displayed in something that akin to where they would normally live, and not just in a cage. And I'm glad to see a place like Como Zoo has made a bigger effort to do natural habitat exhibits, as I think most zoos are doing as well around the world. So that was part of our education mission, was to try and educate and get people excited about seeing animals in that light, rather than just cage after cage and there's a tiger, there's a lion, and actually work at seeing them and getting to know how their behaviors were in more natural habitat. Mm. But we also had a lot of behind the scenes efforts too at conservation. There's a program there that since Siberian tigers were endangered and there's only several hundred left in the wild, that they kind of created a gene database of them, so they wouldn't crossbreed, and so kind of basically increase the gene pool so that you'd have a diversity of the successive tigers, so that they would have would have good diversity in their genes. And so they created an early database of this, and I think those some of the first efforts of any zoo around, and it became world famous to especially for a limited number of endangered species. But I think it's now been copied for a lot of other species as well, so that people are very concerned about crossbreeding and interbreeding, of too much, from kind of a closed captive population. So, and they also worked to reestablish a lot of the animals into the wild as well. So it became a good effort. So, zoos are always a little bit controversial because, you're taking animals out of the wild and putting them in captivity, even if you give them large exhibit areas. But I have always thought that the education and appreciation of these animals, is kind of over, it was more of an advantage, so that having a captive population of animals, had some good merit.
Yeah.
If it was done right.
Well, you give me courage. I have 3 or 4 times snuck up on the idea of doing an animal piece. I wanted to do one about a bat, but lighting a bat is really complicated. And I wanted to do birth for a llama, because they hum for a very long time, and they don't touch the baby, they just hum. So I wanted to do a llama, but it looks as if I'm going to finally do my first animal video with draft horses this summer. It's a guy who wants to tell me about draft horses. But somehow or other I've believed that thing they say in the theater about an animal on stage and haven't. I've got to get braver, but you've done a lot of brave stuff. And
well, I mean, we always had good precaution. We knew which animals you could get closer to, or we were separated. In their holding facilities. We had bars or a wall or something between us. So luckily, you have zoom lenses on the camera, so you can zoom in from being, you know, out of ways. And you also want to be very respectful, because some animals, if they would get very nervous if there's you know, a lot of people around when they're doing that, because of course in the wild, oftentimes they're all by themselves when they give birth. So you have to be careful not to stress the animals. You know, when they're giving birth, or actually almost any of their times you would videotape them.
Well, moving on to the people, although this animal story is, I never knew this. This is great stuff. It's another life I could have had.
Well, it's great fun. I mean,
Yeah.
you get to know the animals too, so you kind of know how they move, and you know, so you kind of learn how to shoot them under what lighting conditions, and you know, through you know, where to set up and get the best angles and shots of them, and you know, when they might get fed, and you know, they get a little more active, and so you kind of learn all these things, and we put together a lot of really good footage out there, and I'm sure, you know, they're still doing that to, you know, an ongoing degree now.
Moving on to the people for a second, you had an incredible opportunity to get at. I mean, I'd kill for Captain Kangaroo.
Yeah.
You know, maybe for Bill Holm too. People I just missed.
Yeah, there are very fascinating stories about a lot of them. It was as much fun meeting them and getting to know them, oftentimes on a good personal basis, as well as hearing their stories and, you know, interviewing them. One of the things we did with the Northern Lights Minnesota Author Interview Series was we paired up interviewers that had a particular interest or knowledge of that author or that subject. And so we didn't have necessarily professional interviewers. There's a lot more conversational. But we found that just about all the subjects, the authors, really enjoyed that, because there's people that actually read their book and were interested in them, and had great questions, and you know, could, you know, carry on good conversations about the you know, about the topic, or about just writing in general. But the last few years that I did Northern Lights, we switched from doing more of a sit-down interview in a TV studio, and we started going out more on location and picking locations or places to video record the authors or the people to kind of replicate some relevant location to their setting. So when I did Bill Holm, when I interviewed Bill Holm, I went out to his house in Minneota, Minnesota, and we did it at his house, but he sat right at his piano, so he even played a little Haydn and for us, and had a great interview. And then he drove me around town, so I sat in his front seat with a video camera, and he gave me a driving tour of Minneota, which was just hilarious. In there's a way only he can describe his hometown, and so we tried to do that in a lot of ways. Bob Carey was a journalist up in Ely, Minnesota, ran the Ely Echo, and wrote a number of books up there. And so he wrote a book about dog sledding. And so we went up and actually got him out on a dog sled and interviewed him up in northern Minnesota, and got some footage of him, you know, dog sledding, and you know, we talked to people running, you know, about the dogs and everything too. So it really worked out great that he wrote a book about it. But then we actually had a lot of, you know, live footage of sled dogs and a little dog sledding track, and got Bob out on the dog sled. He even crashed, but he was fine. He landed in the snow and was laughing all the way about it. And one other fun point was that he had asked me if I cross-country skied, and I said, yeah, I do. And so after we did the interview, we went out cross-country skiing together. So I got a chance to, you know, to get to know him even better, and we do a little skiing up there. And we did it in the winter, of course. And when we did the biography, we interviewed the biographer of Sigurd Olson. Unfortunately, of course, we couldn't get Sigurd Olson; he had passed away. But we videotaped it at his writing shack and out at Listening Point on Burnside. I think it's Burnside Lake, outside of Ely. We were given access to go out and do it right where he wrote a lot of his material. So it was real special to kind of do it there. So we tried to match up, good locations to do the books. We did a person, I think her name was Jenny Kiley, wrote a book about Northeast Minnesota, where we're at now, have a history of Northeast. So we interviewed her at Kramachek's, and we're able to, they picked us an iconic spot right in the Northeast to videotape her. So we tried to do that, and I think that added. It made the show more fun to shoot. It's more work, but it made it more fun to put together. So we'd have a lot more background footage, or we'd have the location footage that we videotaped, and we're able to add that into the final program. So.
Yeah. No.
But we were lucky. Like I mentioned, Mary Delasur was an iconic writer. We interviewed her in her 90s, and Tom McGrath, we interviewed him in his last year of his life, J.F. Powers. Even people later on, I think we did the last interview with George Morrison, and we did that up at his studio up on Lake Superior, up on the Grand Portage Reservation. And we interviewed him and Margot Fortunato Galt, who wrote the book about George Morrison. So we had them both on at the same time, and I got to shoot some footage of his studio where he created a lot of his woodworking, mosaics, and his paintings. So he was a very fascinating person, a very well-regarded artist.
Yeah. Now, just as I'm thinking about the way you've done things, I mean, notice that what I do and what I've done pretty much all the time is a camera on a tripod and it doesn't move. It took me a lot of years to get straight that I needed a light.
Lighting's important.
Yeah, but partly I haven't wanted. I've been worried that, if I get a dog in, if I'm carrying a camera around in northern Minnesota, that all of these complexities, just add possibilities for things to go wrong. And so I've pulled back to a very conservative format and missed these wonderful opportunities. I mean, I wouldn't tape at Kramachek's because I wouldn't want the sound from the next table to mess me up.
It presents more challenges, certainly. We picked a time when Kramachek's wasn't over lunch hour, but I think it turned out pretty good. It wasn't perfect because you're having to set up portable lighting, and the audio is always a challenge because you have a lot of background audio, and no matter, even if it wasn't busy for lunch, Kramachek's has a very busy takeout, and people coming into the kind of the market area there too. We also did William Kent Kruger at St. Croix Broiler in St. Paul, where he did a lot of his writing because he lived in the neighborhood. He just found he could get down to and he had the same booth he always did at, so we videotaped him right in the booth that he wrote at all the time. But we had to pick a time at the St. Croix Broiler. I think we did it at a time when they weren't open, but they were very generous and opening it up for us, and we did it maybe at night or something after they closed it. But it does present challenges because lighting can always be an issue, and like I said, the audio, if you're and even how you arrange a set. If you have 3 or 4 people on, you need to have a good backdrop and things too for that large of a group. But I think it was worth the challenge because again, it got us out of the studio, and we had a nice enough set in the days we were doing it in the studio. But after leaving Hennepin County Library and still continuing with the show and leaving Metro Cable Network, where we videotaped at their studio for a while, we really had to kind of start relying on location shooting and one camera shooting because we didn't have a full studio all the time. We were able to do that occasionally, and we could go into one of the studios on occasion, but we didn't do it regularly anymore. So kind of a what do they say? The necessity is the invention, or there's a term for that, but mother of necessity, mother of invention. But so we kind of ended up having to do a lot more on location. But we had a real good camera, and I took good care of it because that was what we had to work with.
So
But I was able to do things too. And I did a video about winter recreation around the Twin Cities. I very carefully took the camera and on my shoulder and ice skated around, so I got some nice movement with that. I did it on rollerblades one time on a bike trail, so while people were biking along, and so we did some interesting, little ways to videotape it. And but if I didn't feel comfortable on rollerblades or on skis having it, I certainly wouldn't have done it.
Yeah, my speed's about a chair, but I appreciate the adventurous possibilities. We haven't talked all about kids. Was that a different sort of thing for you than the other?
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I think the director of the Hennepin County Library at the time, Robert Rolfe, was very innovative as a library director, and so I owe a lot to his support of these programs, and the fact that we had a TV studio there and he really wanted to make use of it. So I'm not sure how the idea came about, except we wanted to do kind of a public affairs program, and libraries, a large clientele of the libraries are children and families, and so it just, we kind of started the program and it evolved into just a variety of different things. So we did a lot of kind of public affairs oriented programs. So we had people like then Senator Paul Wellstone on talking about legislative issues regarding children and families. We had a lot of local politicians on. We had people from different nonprofit organizations that serve families and children. We did a lot about promoting reading. We got different libraries around to explain their reading programs and how they promoted literacy, and quite a variety of other things. Even going into some schools and seeing how some of the innovative programs that were going on in schools to benefit their students. But we also because of reading and literature, we also ended up video recording a number of children's authors. And so we were lucky that we got some coming through on national tours. There's, like I mentioned, Madeline Langle, who wrote A Wrinkle in Time. Just fascinating people that we were able to get on that series. And we concentrated on some Minnesota children's authors as well, too. It was sometimes hard to determine, well, should we have them on the Northern Lights Minnesota author interview series, or should we have them on All About Kids? So we kind of split them up sometimes. I know Gary Paulson, we had him on both series, so so we were able to interview him twice. And so that program is, from my knowledge, is none of the episodes, we did 283 of those episodes, none of those have been digitized. So that's one of my projects now, is to see about what it will take to get digitizing some or all those episodes, like we have with the Northern Lights series. So the person that I worked with real closely on that program was Gretchen Ronka, who was the then Children's Services Librarian for the Hennepin County Library System before the merger with Minneapolis. So we were just the county libraries at the time, but she was very good in helping, lining up a lot of real interesting guests and doing a lot of the interviews herself. So the series was a little bit different than Northern Lights, but we had a little bit more variety of of what we did. Occasionally we did go out and do location shooting as well to supplement some of the things that were going on. So we kind of started getting the idea from of that since television is a very visual medium, we wanted to expand it, beyond just the TV studio interviews themselves. So a lot of times it really worked out well.
So were these shows running parallel? I mean, were we producing them both at the same
Yeah,
time?
yeah. In fact, that and the National Authors one too. I was doing both. We generally shot we shot a lot of them in the studio. We shot them live to tape. So all we really did was we'd add on an introduction and then the credits on at the end, and anything else we wanted to insert in the middle. But we shot it live to tape, so we'd add the graphics as it was being shot, and didn't have to go back and redo lots of it. So a lot of the early programs didn't take a lot of effort. The Northern Lights and All About Kids series started around the same time, and we were among the first primetime shows on at that time, the brand new regional cable channel 6, Metro Cable Network. And so we had set time slots. I think Northern Lights was 7 p.m. Mondays and All About Kids was 7 p.m. Tuesdays. So we had good viewership as cable channel 6 was shown throughout in just about the entire Twin Cities metro area if you had cable TV. And so we had a good response to that. Jim Ramstad, who's a Congress member, congressional member out in the Western metro area, one time said that, when I get on Channel 6, I hear about it. I know people are watching, so we always used his quote as if anybody was wondering if people were watching these shows, and said, yeah, he got a lot of feedback from when people would see him on our show, or I suppose other Channel 6 shows too, but mostly ours. So those programs, continued for just about the whole run of both lives. After a while, we took the All About Kids series when we left, when Hennepin County Library stopped doing the TV productions. We kept the All About Kids series going for a while through Metronet, but eventually we, as funding was getting harder to find, and the resources, we decided to cut back to just doing the Northern Lights series. The National Authors on Tour series we only did at Hennepin County Library. We did not continue that after that.
Now, I'm curious. So, in a week, you were producing maybe 2 to 3 hours of video in your studio, or on location.
The National Authors on Tour was a little bit more sporadic. We ended up doing 160 of those programs in about 4 years, so about 40 per year. So we would do some replays, just some reruns, just like the
Right.
major network shows would have their either 13 or 26-week series, or runs, and then do repeats. But the Northern Lights, there were several years we did almost one a week at least. We had to kind of schedule it when authors were available too. So sometimes I'd edit 4 or 5 of them at once and have them ready to go, later in the month. And other times, if we didn't have one ready, we would just play one back from an earlier episode. But we kept it pretty fresh. I mean, we were probably average 40 or so a year through most of the years we did it, especially the Northern Lights one. So I think keeping it fresh like that, not just rerunning it all the time, was made it popular too. We would cover things like the opening of the Open Book and organization downtown. So, like I said too, we were involved a little bit with some of the book awards and book festivals, and we would do some maybe do a big poetry reading extravaganza. We would cut and do. We did a very interesting tribute to poet John Ingman, who died, but was very well regarded, and a lot of poets got together and did readings of his. So we did we packaged that all up and made an episode of that one, and I liked that a lot. I liked his poetry a lot.
So, I'm curious about the kind of investment, not so much money, but staff time that it took to make this thing happen. How much of your job was it to keep these shows going?
Well, it varied. When I worked at Hennepin County Library, I also was coordinator or director of that department. So we did a lot of other things in audiovisual. We did audiovisual equipment repair, and went around. Had a couple technicians who went out and made sure that equipment was working in all the library branches, and just a lot of things like that. We also did other library programming too, informational programming on library services and such. So I was able to do a lot on the video front because I had a staff of anywhere from 3 or 4 to sometimes 5 or 6. We had some interns once in a while that would come and help too, and our program librarian at the time, Eileen Cavanaugh, I should give credit to too, because she did a lot of the scheduling and booking of the programs at the library, and then, as I mentioned, Gretchen Ranka did for the All About Kids series. When I left the library and kind of still ended up taking the shows, Gretchen was still a little bit involved, but her involvement went down on the All About Kids series, and so a woman named Sherry Lampman, stepped in and helped a lot with that. And the Northern Lights series, I kind of formed a little an ad hoc advisory committee to kind of help give direction to the show, and then I took over quite a bit of the the scheduling, so especially once we started going out on location, it was easier for me to do the scheduling. So when I could get away and get up and do it, but I had this committee that Eileen still served on, but also people like Patrick Coleman of the Minnesota Historical Society, Bruce Southworth did a lot of our mystery reviews, Patrick O'Donnell did a lot of the poets, and who else was on? Glenda Martin from Minnesota Women's Press helped out a lot because she had a vast knowledge of women's literature in the Twin Cities area. Moira Harris of Pogo Press helped out. We did a lot of work directly with a lot of the small presses, and too, so featuring a lot of Minnesota authors that were involved in, like Grey Wolf and New Rivers Press and places like that. So we had good rapport with a lot of them. They all knew about the program, and we were very happy to supply authors, or we even did little features on the presses themselves. Afton Historical Society Press was a big one. Minnesota Historical Society Press, we did a lot with that. I found a lot of the real fascinating and interviews that I think were very popular with viewers too, were ones that were talked about Minnesota history and Minnesota culture, and both the Minnesota Historical Society Press and Afton Historical Society Press did a lot of books, like that. And I should probably mention others that I'm forgetting, but those were two that we ended up doing a lot of programs with.
So
my time was, I was also doing some other freelance work at the time, and kind of working through Metronet and Minnesota Center for the Book, which had kind of taken over the sponsorship of the Northern Lights series after the library. So we were able to get funding through the Elmer Anderson Foundation and Target stores, and later through the Minnesota Humanities Commission, to keep producing the series. So I would get a stipend for each episode that I produced, and we got backing for the distribution cost of the program, and to keep it airing on Metro Cable Network. And so I was doing other freelance video work at the time too. So I just would balance it out and see what I could do. I eventually Humanities Commission lost a lot of funding the last year that we were doing Northern Lights, and so they were not really in the position to be able to continue funding their portion of the series. And at that time, I ended up with a job at the school district that I ended up working at. So that's when the series kind of came to an end. I wanted to see about keeping it going at least to a certain degree, but eventually I just had to give it up because the job at the school district turned out to be pretty time consuming and challenging.
So, well, I'm just struck that the Hennepin County Library was getting quite a deal. I mean, it was doing major documentation of Minnesota culture, producing an archive, an important couple of important historical archives, doing outreach beyond any imaginable, draw to the library. I mean, you were reaching a whole lot more people than the rest of the library was reaching.
Well, reaching
is,
some that necessarily were. I mean, they're all over the metro area, so they weren't all necessarily Hennepin County Library users. But we were doing it on behalf. MELSA, the Metropolitan Library Service Agency, was also a partner early on. They helped do some funding while we were at the library. And as I said, Metronet, which is also a library consortium of the Twin Cities libraries, was able to help fund projects for me to keep me, keep food on my table. So,
but they were basically getting 2, sometimes 3 shows a week for the half of a professional salary plus the support staff, and
I'd
access
like to
to
think
cable.
I'd like to think we were efficient in what we did and worth the expenses that was put out there, but yeah, some of it's a little hard to quantify. Is like exactly what kind of bargain are you getting? Is it really worthwhile? When the the library administration changed, the new administration was not as supportive of the TV studio or the TV series we were doing, and a couple other programs that the former director had initiated. So there was a big change at the libraries at the time, and some was budget cutting, and some was just a general different direction of philosophy. So I thought it was a shame. Of course, at the time, I would have liked to continue doing it through there because we had the good resources and we had I thought we had a good thing going, and I think it was benefiting the library. But all things do change. So we're lucky to be able to continue it through several other venues. I also give a lot of credit to St. Paul Neighborhood Network, SPNN, because they allowed me to come in and use their editing facilities to edit a lot of the last several years of the Northern Lights series, and then I worked with SPNN on a number of projects too as well.
So, I had great relations with SPNN for a lot of years, actually through the public school folks, through Rich Courier and folks there.
I just worked with Rich 3 days ago.
Wow.
They do their honors concert down at Ordway, and so with the SPNN production band, I went down and worked with Rich and recorded a great event that they do every year down there.
Yeah. So, what is it? I've done this 25 years, and I guess I've probably developed 25 lines for why it's
By the way,
important.
congratulations! Your show's been out a long time, and on Channel 6, and I've caught it at times, just forgetting you were on, and then there I saw it and watched it. And Mary Hansen and Judy Correll both had shows on a long time as well on Channel 6. So it's kind of nice to see that some of the shows kept on over those years.
I'm curious what you think as you think about it. What have you taken to be the point of all this video work?
What's it all about?
What's it all about, Alfie? I'm sure you'd ask Captain Kangaroo, you'd get an answer. Yes,
as for the Northern Lights series, as as such a high, it's the best way to put it. I think we really have a very vibrant literary culture here in Minnesota, especially in the Twin Cities, but actually all around, around the state. And I've always been surprised that the Minnesota Book Awards has really evolved into a big annual event through the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. Now they've taken over the last decade. But I'm surprised that there isn't, that after the Northern Lights series ended in about 2002, that besides, your show that features authors occasionally, and I think people like Mary Hansen, that show, I know she will do an author once in a while, but there really hasn't been a show like the Northern Lights series that kind of filled in the void. I've tinkered with the idea of starting it back up again, although now that I'm retired, I'm not sure how much I want to, invest in, in committing to a long-term series. But I think there's a place for a series like the Northern Lights series in a community that's put such an emphasis on all sorts of arts and culture that the Twin Cities does. And so I have been kind of surprised that there hasn't been, a regular series like that, unless I'm missing it, unless something has come up. And there's, like I said, authors are being featured in different places, but just not as much as, on a regular basis, I don't think. Or if there are, it's not as prominent. So that's one reason that I'm hoping to work to better market the Northern Lights series that we did do. Make sure all the digital online videos are very accessible and the best quality, and make sure that we have them all and people can use them, because I think there are a lot of them that are very relevant. And as far as I know, we're one of the few people that ever have a on-camera TV interview with J.F. Powers, who won the National Book Award, one of the few Minnesota writers that ever won the book award. And he was not akin to interviewing until we suggested John Hassler, who he admired a lot, be the interviewer, and then he quickly agreed. So we ended up having a good hour discussion with J.F. Powers, that probably was very unique. And so I think things like that, if people are interested in his writings and him as an author, it's one of the best ways to find out about him is through the archived interview that we did with him. So I like to make sure that it's fully accessible to libraries and schools all around Minnesota, and that that series, and then maybe looking into digitizing All About Kids and potentially the discussion with National Authors series as well, and just make sure they're there. And then if all goes well, I can get all the videotapes that are in my lower level of my house out of my house and in some either archive, or if they are digitized, then we don't need to keep the tapes anymore. But
what's the total volume? What's the number now of video?
Well, I have a lot of VHS tape copies of the originals. I have some of the originals, the masters. I have 3/4 inch copies that we supplied to cable TV stations, and sometimes multiple copies. And I am not sure. My guess is that anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 tapes I have.
You beat me.
Put together.
You beat me. Well, my basement's becoming unnavigable too. So.
Well, just like Al Milgram, who's the University of U Film Society longtime coordinator and filmmaker, he has a treasure trove of old